Right guys, we have a bunch of new details regarding the M2 MacBook Air from Dylan DKT, and so let's delve into it. But first, make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumours, and with that being said, let's just tuck in. Right, so the first thing Dylan says in this massive thread of information is the release. We should see the new MacBook Air release in the middle of 2022. Now, I believe Minchi Kuo also mentioned this in the past, and to be honest, I'm not too sure about this because I think Apple's going to push back the release of the M2 MacBook Air to October because, let's be honest, for the first half of the year, Apple's going to be focused on getting the transition complete. They have 3 Intel Macs left, and so I can see the bigger iMac and the higher end Mac Mini releasing in the spring, and then of course the Mac Pro's the big announcement for Dub. And so once that transition's complete, then Apple can focus about replacing the already great M1 MacBook Air with an M2 version. And also do remember the bigger iMac, the higher end Mac Mini and the Mac Pro are going to be using versions of the M1 chip. And so it would be pretty odd for Apple to release the M2 chip so soon after the release of these M1 Pro, M1 Max, and maybe even M1 Pro Max. And so yes, I do think it's in Apple's best interest to space out the releases and give us the M2 MacBook Air towards the end of the year. Now the next tidbit Dylan says does make sense for the most part. That's MagSafe, the 1080p webcam, USB-C ports, the 30-watt power adapter, and of course no fans coming to this MacBook Air. Now MagSafe's going to give these MacBook Airs fast charging. The 1080p webcams come to every redesigned Mac, and so I do think the MacBook Air is going to follow suit. And of course USB-C ports make sense, since we should see a similar layout to the current version, with the legacy ports being an exclusive feature to the Pros. Now the 30-watt power adapter does make sense, since I believe that's what Apple gives us right now with the MacBook Air, but do remember this would not give you enough power for fast charging, and so much like we see with the base 14-inch MacBook Pro, I think Apple's going to upsell you to a more powerful charger on the checkout page. Now of course, like previous reports mentioned, Dylan does say that we should see colours similar to the 24-inch iMac come over to this MacBook Air with M2. Now I do like the colours Apple gives us with the iMac, and so I do very much welcome those with the MacBook Air, but do note, Apple's been a little wacky with their colours, and so I would not be surprised if the MacBook Air gets a completely different colour palette from the iMac. Dylan also says the bezels and the keyboards are going to be an off-white colour, much like the iMac, and also you're going to see full-size function rows, again much like the iMac and of course the recently announced MacBook Pros. Now this is what could put me off the MacBook Air, because the white bezels, especially with a notch, would be a recipe for disaster. That would look hideous, and so I do think if Apple's going to give us a notch, please at least offer a midnight or space grey option with black bezels. Now to be honest, I'm pretty impartial to the colour of the keyboards. I don't really care about that, and it will be interesting to see if the keyboard area is completely white, much like the keyboard area is black with these new MacBook Pros. And that leads me on to Dylan's next point. The design is apparently going to be very similar to the MacBook Pros, but it should be lighter and thinner because of course it does not have as many internal components, and of course there aren't as many ports on the side. Now I guess this does mean Dylan believes the iconic wedge shape is going from the MacBook Air, much like previous reports had stated. Now this would be a pretty interesting move because of course with the iMac, Apple kept the chin because that makes the iMac an iMac, and so it's pretty interesting that Apple's getting rid of the most iconic design element of the MacBook Air, which is the wedge-shaped design. Though that does bring me on to a point that Dylan mentions in this report, and that of course is the fact this could just be the MacBook. Apple could drop the Air Moniker and make this the regular MacBook, like we've had in the past. Now this would explain why Apple's getting rid of the wedge shape, and to be fair, considering this is heavily based on the iMac, and that has no additional suffix in its name, I can see why Apple might call this just the MacBook. Also of course with a thinner, lighter, smaller design, this in terms of size could be more in line with the 12-inch MacBook, And so again, that might be another reason why this might be just the MacBook, since it's a spiritual successor of sorts to that original 12-inch MacBook from 2015. Though again, I know the MacBook Air name is very popular, so of course, we shall wait and see. Anyways, going back to the report, Dylan does say we should see binned versions of the M2 chip with the MacBook Air. Now this does make sense because we saw a binned 7-core GPU version of the M1 with the current MacBook Air. So I do think we're going to see a 9-core GPU binned version of the M2, and then of course the regular M2 with the 10 GPU cores. Multiple external display support is also going to be available with this M2 MacBook Air. Now this was an issue with the M1 models and has been fixed with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max MacBook Pros. And so yes, I'm happy to hear this MacBook Air is going to support at least 2 displays. Now Dylan also believes we'll see mini LED with these MacBook Airs. That's the same tech we see on the MacBook Pros, the Pro Display XDR, and of course, the iPad Pro. But of course, some of you guys may be wondering how Apple's going to differentiate the MacBook Pro's display from the MacBook Air. And of course, like we see with the iPad range and the iPhone range, it seems to be ProMotion, because Dylan says we should not see ProMotion on the MacBook Air, so that is going to be a Pro exclusive. We should also see no Face ID, which makes sense, no SD card slots, no tapered design as I mentioned, and also no HDMI. Dylan also expects a price hike with this MacBook Air, which does make sense because we saw a price hike with the redesigned MacBooks, and so this, with the redesign and the new chip, and of course mini LEDs, should warrant a price hike. Also, do remember that Mark Gurman has said the M1 MacBook Air is going to stay in the lineup alongside this M2 version, so I do think Apple's going to retain the M1 model at $1,000, and then of course the M2 version goes to maybe $1,299, and of course that means it could replace the MacBook Pro M1 in the lineup, which I think Apple should very much do. Since of course, as I've said in the past, especially with these new MacBooks, it's pretty odd that Apple still got that older MacBook Pro design with the touch bar around in the lineup. And also do remember it's very similar to the M1 MacBook Air, so I do think replacing that with the M2 MacBook Air would be the right move. And finally, Dylan reiterates we should see the M2 chip. This should have a similar layout to M1, so 4 power cores, 4 efficiency cores, but of course these will be A15 cores, not the A14 cores we saw with the M1. We've also heard a beefier GPU is coming to these MacBooks that could be 10 cores. So yeah, that's everything we know about this M2 MacBook Air, but tell me in the comments below guys, are you thinking of getting this when it launches in 2022? Anyways, thank you for watching guys, make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumours. Check out the video in the card above on details regarding the M1 Max iMac. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya peeps.